So, how to live a life with no regrets? I think everyone knows this answer. It's like this age old thing. It's one of those things where the elders have for centuries been, hammering us with this knowledge. Everyone knows the famous study too about people getting interviewed on their deathbeds and everyone having the same few regrets, which is like, relationships. They've been working too much, not spending enough time on the things they actually enjoy doing, and et cetera, et cetera. So everyone knows what to do on paper, but it's one of those unteachable lessons. It's one of those things where it's really, really, really hard to actually, set the priorities correctly at any given moment, where everything else is just our brain is kind of programmed to set us up for failure in this sense, because we're really wired to chase status, money, and all these material stuff that don't really pay off later. So we're really distracted by all these fake goals during our life, and day to day, we're just too busy to stop and kind of reflect on actually making the correct decisions. And if we do, it usually manifests in not action, but rather the exact thing we're trying to avoid, which is regrets. Often what happens is that in our daily life, we're just really, really distracted about doing our thing. We're just doing our busy work and stuff. And then once in a blue moon, we actually stop and think about what the fuck we're doing right now. And usually what happens is that it's in the middle of the night where you're just kind of looking at the ceiling and having just a bunch of regrets about your life. And you think, oh, if only I, did this in college now, I would have, pursued a thing that I'm interested in now, right? If only I didn't commit to this path, but I committed to another path back in the day. All these stuff just come into our minds. And what I want to talk about today is something different, from just the knowledge of the essential list of what to, pay attention to, which is like relationships and doing the thing you love and blah, 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 which I feel like is really useful, but it's the same as you knowing that a stove is hot and you actually having a structure in place to avoid getting burnt, right? I could know the stove is hot, but I just could be, living my life completely unresponsibly around it, right? I just been fucking messing around with it and just asking to get burnt. Or I could be staying the fuck away from it and leading a life by principles that actually guide me on these moments of uncertainty, on how to maximize the realities where I'm happy or not, regrets. I don't know what is like fulfillment maxing, I guess, or something like that. I'm still young and still stupid. I'm gonna make a lot of mistakes, but I do have a framework in place that I've successfully implemented over the last, 5, 6 years that has allowed me to look back at my, early adult life and say, fuck yeah, I've actually have no regrets, right? I've consistently proven to myself, and a lot of my friends would agree that I've consistently been able to say fuck you to the typical society norms and pursued the goals I have. And with time, they have all, slowly but surely worked out in a favorable manner. Up to this point, I still have many mistakes to be made in my life. But yeah, I want to record this video, in the sense of myself, as well as a reminder later on, if I can lose my way, I can look back at it and think about the lessons that I have learned and just kind of remind myself of them and make sure that I can kind of course correct if need be. So, a few things I want to touch on. The first concept I want to talk on is just kind of spinning that regret narrative. I think a big part of why we as humans have this thing, this problem that comes up, is just, I feel like I'm a big believer in like evolutionary psychology, maybe some behavioral stuff too. but I'm just a big believer in it being traced back to some kind of primal, stuff. And this one seems pretty logical to me, where regret obviously is a ruminating mechanism that's in our brains in order to prevent us from making the same mistakes again and again. So if we make a really costly mistake in the past, we really want to make sure not to do it again. And regret is a kind of process that enables us to remember. What happens though is that, modern age and everything, it's way different than it was back in the good old hunter-gatherer days. So back then, if you weren't careful in the forest, you didn't notice a lion or didn't notice tracks of lions, or I don't know, made a mistake, you got your hand bit off, or you got your, tribesman killed. It was a really, really costly mistake, and it was important that we have these mechanisms in place that reminds us not to make these mistakes. But in this day and age, we have so little actual risk, at least in my, and I'm so blessed for this, at least in, the Western societies that I'm so fortunate to grow up in and live in. We just have so little actual risk attached to our decisions. It's pure pizzazz in our minds that has made it feel like it's so important not to make those mistakes again, while in reality, there's so little consequences. Like, obviously, specters to everything. I think in the general sense, obviously, there's exceptions to every rule. And there's a lot of people, where mistakes actually do cost them their lives. But at the same time, I am a strong believer of believing the things that actually bring me benefit. It doesn't make sense for me to believe that something's going to go wrong if it actually doesn't help me solve a solution. And this is one of those things where I know for a fact that just sitting there ruminating about a bad decision I made doesn't actually improve my situation. So I need to create a framework that will allow me to transmute this phenomena into something productive. So this is how I kind of go about it. First things I do, I came up with this concept way back in high school. Me and my buddy were at top of the library rooftop, and he was kind of, explaining his woes to me. And it was in high school, right? We were teenagers, but he already had a bunch of regrets that he told me he had. And at that time, I was a complete degenerate. It was one of those moments where wisdom came to me. It was like a correct solution with completely bad inputs. But I realized already back then that it made so little sense to live with regret all the time, because you can only really acknowledge that the past decisions you made were really made from the information you had at the time, from the information you had at the time, from the mental state you had in time, from the psychological state you had in time, from the emotional kind of, framework you were working off of. And as you kind of go, especially with longer memories, you kind of forget that. You forget that the stupid decision you made when you were young was based on completely different inputs than you have now. And you kind of gloss over those inputs and just focus on the fact that you made a wrong decision and that cost a bad output. And this gives really too much weight on that decision, and you kind of feeling a sense of, yeah, fulfillment, no, but a sense of uh, something that you're doing something when you're ruminating about this bad decision. Once again, back to the ooga booga brain, you have developed this thing that you can't make the same mistake again. But this day and age, the likelihood of you coming around those same decisions is so far removed, because we're not, fucking hunter gatherers, right? So you already have the lesson. Right now, the current you is a completely different beast. It has all this extra knowledge, all this extra experience, all this extra, and like a completely different emotional state. There's no actual reason for you to believe that giving the same opportunity or the same situation come around to you this time, that you won't be able to act on it. So with this in mind, I realized already back then that ruminating about past regrets is so destructive, because you're not giving yourself any slack there. you're kind of holding your past self to your today's standards. So the first thing you kind of have to do is like shift this regret mindset into allowing yourself to hold your past self accountable to the standards of your past self. That's the first step. This will kind of allow you to minimize the pain you feel about your past mistakes, because you kind of have to, anytime you have this, you're going to have to soothe yourself and stop making such a big deal out of it by saying, hey, I made those decisions because of my mental state at the time, because of my knowledge at the time, because of this, and that. They're completely reasonable decisions. And if I was back in that day, I would have made it the same decision. Why? Because I would have been in the same mental state. You know what I mean? So that's the first step. You're gonna have to push out the old air from your past self and not just have that weight. Then what happens next? Next, you have to actually, like I said, we have to think about a mindset that will actually be productive for us. And the thing is about living a life with no regrets. From my observation from the sidelines, because I said I've been doing 5 years really, really good at not being, having regrets. It's a case of you realizing that something is wrong. So you having this moment of reflection and realizing, oh shit, I've been doing something wrong. And instead of you changing your behavior, giving this new information, because I would call it new information, even though it might be really delayed from your past mistakes. If something comes up to your brain and you have a realization that you've been doing something for a really long time that's false, that's new information, at least how I consider it at my mind, because my mind can only, take in so much information. So when something comes up, even if it was buried deep under there, if it's fresh, I have to treat it like new information. And if it's new information, the way you learn is that you change your behavior based on new information. So what you have to do is figure out a structure for you to allow yourself to actually change your behavior. So what I did is something that I call like um, timeline pruning with identity switching. So the concept came up like 5, 6 years back. That was the first time I started really actively trying to implement this kind of way of thinking. Back then, it was like 2 years after I graduated high school. I was a dropout out of uni for a year at that point, I think. And I was like experimenting with all kinds of business ideas. I was a complete degenerate still, though. I was drinking every fucking day. I was smoking weed every fucking day. I was, playing video games like at least 5 hours a day. I was doing part-time jobs. At the few hours that I had left, I was kind of experimenting with business ideas. And at that time, we were really, really into forex trading. Me and my buddies didn't work out. Wasn't really that good at it, but I took it seriously at that time, as a lot of like business ideas we had at the time. And what happened one night is that my buddy came over to trade, but he had a really tough day at work, so he wanted to kind of let off steam. So instead of trading, he just wanted to chill, maybe have a couple beers, ended up being a couple whiskeys, and just talk about his day. But I was still really committed to doing trades. So, but I matched his kind of pace of drinking. And what ended up happening was that I just got too fucking drunk. I got too drunk to make a trade. And that was the first time in my life at that time where this bad habit has manifested into something that I truly recognize as destructive behavior, right? Because you don't really think you have a problem until it affects your relationships and your work. And it didn't. I didn't allow myself to affect any of it up to that point. But I took trading seriously. And at that time, it happened, right? My bad habit actually negatively impacted the results of the thing that I considered like actual work. That was like a big news flash. And this is what I mean about new information coming in. It wasn't a fucking mystery that drinking is bad for you. It wasn't a fucking mystery that if I drank too much, I would not able to do my, duties. Yet it took me this very specific, point of concoctions of situations for me to actually realize this. So I had two opportunities: either make it the same night as it always has been, where I wake up in the next morning and, throw myself a glass of whiskey and keep going, the same as I have been, or I take this as an opportunity to change. So at that time, I had like vivid flashbacks of my stepdad, who unfortunately has also since passed, but he also fell on the cork, as they say in Latvian. He also just, fell, had a really bad relationship with alcohol and ended up just drinking himself to death, unfortunately. But yeah, I had this flashback of seeing him drunk when I was young, and kind of thinking how, despicable and how, you know, shit it looked. And I kind of, at that state, I was even able to taste, like imagine myself in that situation. And I realized that if I keep up this bad habit, there's always going to be that timeline where that could become a reality. Sure, there can be a timeline where I kind of have it under control and just be a normal life. But there's also a timeline when I just gonna keep going the same pace I had been, and instead of, picking myself up and making, a successful business or a career or anything, I just go downwards and just drink myself to death. And once I realized that this one thing that I'm doing is really directly contributing to a timeline that I don't like, I also realized that if I didn't have this thing in my life at all, the likelihood of me getting to that timeline is essentially zero. And that gave me a really, really strong realization that if I become a person, this is the identity thing, if I become a person that doesn't drink at all, I completely remove that timeline from the equation. As long as I keep consistent with this identity, boom, that timeline is just effectively completely removed. Since that realization, first of all, I actually did that. That was the last day I ever drank. For 5 years now, I think. I'm not really keeping track. I don't even know what was the day I didn't actually have that. I didn't make it that big of a deal. I'm gonna touch on that as well. But the reality is that yeah, did the flip. I did the switch. I switched from being a person who drank all the time and being recognized by people by the guy who had like an iron liver to the person that doesn't drink at all. I also became a person that enjoyed working out. I also became a person that enjoyed reading. Then I became a person that enjoys taking on a responsibility and risk and is entrepreneurial. And this is all allocated to these identities. So, what is the blocker for you to kind of establish a new identity? From what I can gather from my experience, it's usually shame. For me, what really, really, really helped is just really brutally, openly talking to everyone about all my shameful, the things I consider most shameful. I just kept, freely telling it to everybody. Like there was a practice that I started implementing because I realized that shame is the number one reason you stay stuck. Why is that? Why did I come to this conclusion? So what I kind of realized is that the reason you're not making a big dramatic switch in identity is because from the outside view, you're shamed that you would have to recognize or admit that the thing that you've been doing, the identity that you have been spending years establishing, has been wrong. And it's really tough. It's really, really tough because you have a feeling that it's one of those ooga booga moments again, right? Because you want to make sure that you're elevated in status when it comes to, people comparing themselves to you. And is you put yourself in a situation where you openly admit that you've been really dumb for a really long time, you have this sense that your status will drop and you will get thrown out of your clan and you will die, which is just not true. Even if it is, you're gonna find a new clan. I don't want to talk about it because I've been so fortunate enough that all my friends kind of followed suit and also transitioned into this self-development journey and also became individuals that adopted identities that were really, really pleasant to kind of grow next to. But yeah, that's the trigger. I feel like that's the blocker. And big part of it is the thing that we talked about earlier, where your past gets more weight than it should. So what happens is that when you're met with this turning point, with this decision, when this new aha moment comes to you have all this inertia of the decisions you've made before and the regrets you've made before that's kind of backing up you not making a change. So it ends up being easier just ruminating about, oh, I should have done that 5 years ago. I should have started working out 5 years ago. I should have started making a business 5 years ago. I should have done this and this 5 years ago. It's easier to kind of blame your past self than it is to admit that your current self is smarter and can do a better decision than your past self. Because the moment you do that switch, all of a sudden, all that commitment, all that time is now like effectively been written off as you being an idiot. So you've been an idiot for 5 years. That's what it feels like when you try to make that identity switch instead of, you know, instead of what it should be, which is I am way smarter than I am now 5 years ago and I can make better decisions than I did 5 years ago. It feels like, oh shit, I've been an idiot 5 years straight. And if I change this identity, I cannot admit that. And the more it drags on, the worse it gets because the years just compound and you've now been an idiot for a longer and longer time. So there's more of a switching cost. So my solution to this is just detaching yourself from these past regrets by internalizing them of what they are, mistakes that you made, giving that very specific concoction of mindset, emotional state, situation state, knowledge, everything. And you got to give yourself some slack and say, hey, my past self was a dumbass and that's fine, right? He did the best he could with what he was given. What can I do now to make sure that my future self, that my future timeline is a one that I don't look back at and regret? What I found was it was way easier to figure out timelines that you will regret, rather than timelines that you are confident that are the ones, right? It's really, really hard to kind of figure out the one timeline that you have everything you want because you don't fucking know what you want. You're gonna figure it out as you go. But it's way, way easier to kind of prune out the timelines that obviously are not what you want. For me, it was obviously the timeline where I became a drunk and I had, maybe it hurt my relationships. Or maybe, I had it was the timeline where I came home drunk to my spouse and, my kids hated me because I'm drunk and, I didn't have a stable family life. And this is all can be avoided if I become a person that doesn't drink. The next up is, I don't know, a timeline where I'm not free to explore my interests, a timeline where I'm stuck at a desk job for the whole day and not able to freely, find the time where I can spend with my family. So shit, if I want a job like that, I have to be independent. I have to be a freelancer. I have to have my own business. So I had to become entrepreneurial. I have to become a person that's an entrepreneur that can make this thing happen. I really didn't want a timeline where I didn't have any knowledge to bestow, on my kids. I didn't want to have a timeline where I'm a dad that can't pass on important lessons to his kids. So shit, I have to educate myself. I have to become a person that's happy to get educated and that reads and that researches. I know that I don't want a timeline where I'm not able to run around with my kids or not able to explore the world, not able to walk in nature, and not able to get out of bed. So I need to stay healthy, right? I need to work out. I need to exercise. I need to eat healthy. I need to, not die. um, so yeah, it's way easier to figure out timelines where you don't want to be. And then you can really easily attach identities of what kind of person do you need to be to make sure that that timeline just doesn't happen, or at least if it's such a small likelihood, or at least like minimize the opportunity as much as possible for the bad timeline to occur. And then whatever fucking happens is gonna be pretty solid. that's, that's my whole takeaway. This like the main thing at the beginning where like I said, I haven't figured everything out, but one thing for certain, the last 5 years, last 6 years that I've been committing to this kind of mindset has really, I can confidently say that I've been having a really, really fun life. And I can look back and say, fuck, I'm really confident that I've been making strides in the correct directions. Really, mostly because I've just know for a fact that I'm really avoiding the bad scenarios. I'm really avoiding the really, really shit scenarios. And that makes it, even if the resulting thing in 5 years, probably 5 years back, I thought I would be a millionaire. This time I'm not. But at the same time, I'm here and I'm like, fuck, I have a good life. Like, and yeah, I think it's oftentimes way more beneficial for you to think how to avoid really, really regretful scenarios rather than, figure out what are the specific things or the specific timeline you need to pursue to make everything like perfect. It's not going to be perfect, but you just have to avoid the catastrophic failures. Chris Williamson has this great line. He says, "Don't multiply by zero." Basically, what can you do to not multiply by zero? That's one of these cases. So yeah, that's my 2 cents. The idea being that, yeah, you're gonna have to look more to the future than the past, and you have to have these identity switches, and you have to be willing to do them. Another thing I can add just to end this video off is that when you're trying to do this, often you're gonna try and fail. And when that happens, you might be thinking that, ah, you might have that feeling that nothing changed, or that, for example, you want to try lose fat, you try and you fail. When you fail, I want you to understand that once again, every single thing that happened is in the past. It's the same fucking logic applies. Just you gotta realize that the mistake 10 years ago is just as important as the mistake few moments ago, or it's not just as important, or just as irrelevant to your future as the mistake few moments ago, right? Like, you might be thinking that last summer you tried to lose weight, but you didn't. And none, you're not gonna try because now that regret is like, oh, if only I kept working out last summer. It's the same. It's the same as the same regret. What if I stopped working 5 years ago? You have to start recognizing these patterns. And as you're gonna start recognizing these patterns and keep trying to change them when they come up, as soon as they come up, you're gonna train your mind to do this consistently. At one point, for example, for me, very recently, I, have my freelancing business. I've been working on it for a long time. It's completely online now for a year. I've been working on, and the whole goal of having this freelancing business was to have the freedom to explore life. And I knew for a fact that one of my biggest goals before I have kids is to live, around the world a bit. And I specifically wanted to do it in a fashion where I just didn't travel on big expensive trips. I wanted to, go to a country for a month, then another country for a month, and another, and just kind of explore the world, explore the cultures as I go. And I had this business going for a year, and also I had that realization moment of, wait, what am I doing right now? I have a business. I'm working like 12, 16 hours a day, every single day, just fucking crushed every day. Um, Yet my whole goal was to have the freedom here. So wait, what is happening now? Why did I end up having a business that leads to a timeline that I'm not happy with? Right? Because that timeline where I keep working my bones off is a timeline where it leads to maybe probably more money, probably more success, but it also leads me to a timeline where I have worked all of the time I could have spent exploring, right? When I get that money, when I get that freedom, at that point I'm gonna want to have kids because I want to have a timeline where I'm a parent when I'm relatively young. That's more important to me than having a timeline when I'm fucking rich. I want to avoid a timeline where I have my first kid when I'm 40, or I want to avoid the timeline when I'm 35 trying to make kids and I can't because, fucking health these days is fucked up. A lot of people have this problem these days, and I'm kind of concerned about that. But So yeah, I want to make it this fucking as soon as possible because that's important to me. I want to avoid those bad scenarios. For that to be true, I have to take my priorities right now. I'm gonna list them out and realize that fuck, at this point in time, I have the best opportunity go around the world and travel. So I have to take that opportunity. And I did it, you know. After a few months, I sold all my shit and I left. Now I'm in Pisa, Italy. I'm in a different country. And I'm gonna be moving to Georgia next month. The month after that, I'm gonna probably go to Asia. And yeah, it all came from the same muscle, the same principle of me not being attached to the old identity that was, hey, I'm a hustle, bro, right? I hustle, I work 12-hour days, doesn't matter. I'll get it done. I'm gonna be reachable anytime. I had to throw that identity away. I have to call my clients and say, sorry, I had to fire you because I have different priorities right now. I had to talk to my existing clients and put some boundaries and say, hey, I'm gonna be fucking traveling the world, so not gonna be able, you know, to communicate every single day, every single hour. I'm going to be available from this and this time. And you know, the only reason it was possible because over the years I've trained this muscle to be able to recognize the patterns when they are and act on them as I recognize them. And you don't need to feel bad that you're not really good at that at the beginning. Because for me, it really helped to have that really drastic switch when with the drinking story because it was so emotionally charged that it kind of really elevated me out of that rut. I don't think it's that easy for most. I think for most, it's a way more intricate and hard process of you really slowly breaking up bad patterns and bad habits. But as long as you don't give up and as long as you don't put weight on your past mistakes and interpret them as your identity, instead, all you have to really think about is what do I identity I need to adopt right now for to me to eliminate the bad timelines. Not about what how to maintain an identity, how to actively choose an identity. You have to be able to like put little to no, you know, weight on your past identity and put every single decision on your like all the agency you can muster on your current predicament. So yeah, that's my takeaway. Hope this helped somebody and then subscribe and like. Bye.